in the recent past, we have not been short of political books in this country, but we're about to talk around one of the better and more compelling ones that has hit our shelves recently. It's called From Marabastad to Mogadishu, and it's the recounting of the journey of ANC soldier Hassen Ebrahim. He took part in some of the defining moments in South Africa's transition from apartheid right through to constitutional democracy. The book details how the underground machinery of the ANC was established and successfully operated. Perhaps more importantly, though, Hassen also part of the important group of people who helped draft the Constitution of South Africa. The book also explores his work in the public service and with the United Nations in Mogadishu, which I guess is one of the reasons for the title. Hassen, such a warm welcome to you. You're a person, like many others, who spent decades in exile fighting for something that you fervently and truthfully believed in. As I say, one of many people. Was there a specific turning point in your life when you said to yourself, I need to leave in order to help?
Yes, there was. It was the unfortunate demise of Solomon Mahlangu. I decided then that I needed to be part of the solution and not be part of the problem. That was a defining moment in my history. I felt compelled to do something about it. I felt I had ability to do something, and whatever I could contribute, I needed to contribute. And that was my deciding moment.
Courage is such an overtraded word. It's become such a cliche, hasn't it? But it can't have been an easy decision, in spite of the conviction that you had. What you were essentially doing was upending your life.
Yeah. I don't think I fully understood it when at that age. I was more compelled by the moment. I felt the urge to do something. The dangers or the problems or the challenges of it didn't occur to me. I wasn't given an opportunity to even consider that.
So strong was the conviction?
I think that the moment, being part of what we refer to as a 76th generation, we didn't have the luxury of thinking about things. We were thrown into the struggle. And so we were compelled without having the opportunity to think about it.
In an interview of this duration, one can never get to grips entirely with your life, but you grew up in Marabastad, which is the genesis of the book, and it was a close-knit, caring family, you write, general dealers and hawkers. How did you then come to the political space?
I think it is more about the social consciousness of the community, the sense of justice, the sense of pride. The fact that Marabastad originated out of the Group Areas Act and a terrible situation in which we suffered the ravages of apartheid. And in that instance, we grew up with the sense of justice and felt compelled not only to be kind to each other, but to respect the community at large. Marabastad was a melting pot of different communities. So you had African people a street away, colored people another street away, and apart from the Apis River, you had the white community. So we all grew up in a very small, confined area, and we learned to respect each other's cultures.
Small, confined area. How difficult was it for you then to escape that, to go to the University of Durban-Westville?
It was incredibly difficult, yes. I remember very clearly my father had to borrow money to actually get me to university. He couldn't afford to pay for textbooks and the registration and so on. So it was incredibly difficult, but a big moment for us. It was a crisis in our home, only because I did not agree to going to a bush college. I refused, and my father felt he couldn't afford anything else. If he could afford it, he would have sent me out to the country, but he couldn't. So that was it, and I had to go to Westville University.
And then you talk about how difficult it was to join the ANC.
Yeah. I think there's a myth about how popular and how prolific and active the ANC was. At that point in time, I could find no evidence of the ANC structures in the country and in my close proximity. So the only way in which I found the ANC was to leave the country. So I left the country literally to actually go and find the ANC.
And how did you do that?
I was fortunate enough to find a friend at university who who studied in Botswana. And I figured that if he studied in Botswana, he would have known somebody in the ANC. And fortunately it did. And it was no other than knowing Marius Koen, the late Marius Koen. And so I got a letter of introduction from him. And off I went to Botswana in a whim.
Let's skip Botswana with respect, okay, because there's much to get through. You then spent time in Angola.
Yes.
And you also write at length about how difficult that was in the training camps.
Yes. Angola was a fascinating experience. It was difficult. We didn't see the difficulties. We were all full of militant fervor and revolutionary zeal. And we were focused on learning the trades of warfare and learning how to fight and to engage in struggle, and waiting to come back into the forward area, not knowing where we would be deployed. But it was very difficult in considering the fact that we went for months without milk, sugar, basic necessities, and not the easiest of environments, no.
I want to try, if I can, to get into the mind of a young man at that time. You talk about militant fervor, revolutionary zeal.
Yeah.
In your mind, with what intention? What did you expect at that point was going to happen?
I think we all, as young people, dreamt of the day when we would march through the streets of Pretoria, AK slung over the shoulder and claiming liberation as they did in Cuba and the other...
Your Che Guevara moment.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we dreamt about. As young people, that's all we focused on. We felt convinced that it was possible, it was real. Nobody thought about a negotiated solution, but we felt liberation was a very real thing, and it drove us, and we were very compelled to actually act in the way in which we did, yeah.
I'm correct in saying that you then returned in 1985?
I returned to Botswana, yes.
Botswana in 85. Yes. When, what happened at that point then? So you'd finished in Angola, you were full of the zeal that you speak about. Yes. What then? Well,
in Botswana, the only way in which I could remain legally present in Gaborone was to study. So I studied law. And so in 1985, I completed my stint in University of Edinburgh and came back to Gaborone, where I then finished my last year of law studies and entered into the legal fraternity as an attorney.
And then the return to South Africa?
1991.
So things had taken, at that point, a slightly different turn. You weren't marching through the streets with the weapon slung over your shoulder.
No.
What do you remember when you came back?
It was very different. It was a very confused sense. Bear in mind that by the end of the 80s, we were extremely successful both militarily and politically. So with all the structures that we had, I was one of those that didn't quite like the idea of suspending armed struggle. We were so successful. We needed to carry on with the struggle. But lo and behold, there was a...
How did that test your resolve? Because it would not have only been you, but many others who would have felt the same way.
Yes, it did test our resolve. But I suppose as a good soldier, we took our instructions and we followed them. And if that was the instruction, that's what we did. And so, in fact, it didn't take long before we were then compelled to actually participate in the negotiation process with the very people who would have had us on their hit list.
So let's talk about Codesa quickly, because you were there. How much hope did you give it? How much were you optimistic that the end was in sight at that point?
Absolutely. Codesa was incredibly exciting for us as young people. For me, in particular, it gave me a ringside seat into the changes that were taking place in the country. And sometimes,
what do you remember most about that?
I think the greatest opportunity for me was to listen to some of the best political and legal minds in the country and, in fact, in Africa, at play in trying to define what the future of South Africa would look like. We had long been complaining about what apartheid did to us, but now we were given an opportunity to define really what is it that the transition should be like and what the future of the country should be like.
It wasn't easy at the time, was it?
No, it was incredibly difficult, but exciting nonetheless. It was defining moments for me.
Then came another defining moment, and that was the Constitution. This vital, critical document that defines all of our existence in this country and has been a blueprint and an aspiration for many other countries. I want, if you can, to give us an intimate look at the process. So you're sitting down and you have to write a constitution. It's not like writing a television script.
No.
How did you do that?
I think the most difficult thing and the most exciting thing that people often forget is that when the first parliament came into being in May 1994, all of the MPs were equally filled with revolutionary fervor and zeal. And so when they took a resolution as to how the Constitution was going to be adopted and debated, they took a fairly interesting resolution which suggested that the people from the Limpopo to Cape Town and through all of the villages should be consulted. It saw the birth and the emergence of what we refer to as participatory democracy. So the Constitution was negotiated against a background where we were obliged to consult with a large majority of the people, given the fact that at that point in time there were still no-go zones and areas. The country was still in conflict.
But the physical crafting of it, the language, the legalese, the picking over nuance.
Yes.
You must recall that with vivid clarity.
With absolute clarity, because I think the mistake many observers make is that they think the crafting of the Constitution started when we started work in 1994. It didn't. It started well before that. It started in 1912. So in 1930, when you had the African claims in response to the Atlantic Charter, which saw the birth of the United Nations, you saw African people and South African people crafting what they felt should be like the aspirational ideas. And then you had the Freedom Charter in 1955. So we had built on a real history of knowledge, of ideas, of thought, of political ideas, and visionary thought in terms of what South Africa should look like. We used all of that together with the experiences that we had, and we added to that the incredibly talented legal skills that we had with the political leadership.
But you had the ingredients,
yes.
But it was also a very complicated recipe,
yes.
and also a difficult one to assemble.
Yes, very difficult, only because we needed to make sure that we were particularly conscious that even the minority groups had to be given a particular place at the table. So even their voices needed to be heard. So while South Africa's, the Constitution had to be the will of the majority, it had to take into account the interests and the fears of the minorities. And that's really where the importance of it came.
I'm correct in saying, Hassen, that you also believe this Constitution is a living document.
Yes.
It's not set in stone.
Yes.
It needs to constantly be assessed, and if you're assessing something, you're going to change it.
Yes.
That in itself brings a lot of complications, though.
I think that you're correct in describing it as a living document. Constitutions live as societies do and evolves as society evolves. Whilst constitutions should not be willy-nilly changed because it creates unpredictability, so it needs to remain solid in its fundamental principles. But certainly the Constitution is required to respond to the needs of society as society changes. And therefore it is important for it to be a living document.
The book cover quotes Albie Sachs as saying, "A hero without heroics, what a life, what a story." It's called From Marabastad to Mogadishu, the journey of an ANC soldier. Hassen Ebrahim, it's a deep honor and privilege to have spoken to you. I wish we had more time.
Thanks very much
for joining us.